He carried that tattoo for 3 years. 3 years of mess hall jokes. 3 years of guys calling her the girl with the wolf scratch. 3 years of being handed inventory lists while real soldiers got rifles. Then came the morning everything stopped. 850 meters, a hostage building, a shot no trained marksman would dare attempt. And Avery Collins, the quiet logistics girl everyone laughed at, picked up that rifle like she'd never put one down. What happened next took 8 seconds. 8 seconds that ended careers, shattered assumptions, and forced an entire base to reckon with what they'd been mocking all along. If stories like this deserve to be heard, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The joke started, as most things at Raven Ridge did, over bad coffee and too much free time. It was specialist Danny Kowalski who saw it first, or claimed he did, which amounted to the same thing socially. They were in the locker bay, post-PT, the kind of damp and fluorescent space where everything smelled like rubber mats and old sweat. Avery Collins had her back half-turned while she pulled her patrol jacket off the hook, and the sleeve of her PT shirt rode up just enough to catch the light. The tattoo ran from just below her left shoulder down toward the curve of her arm. Dense black line work, a wolf's head rendered in something between realism and geometry, surrounded by smaller symbols that didn't quite read as anything specific from a distance. Kowalski squinted at it like it personally offended him. "Collins, the hell is that on your arm?" She didn't turn around immediately. Finished buttoning the jacket, smoothed the front panel, then looked over her shoulder with the expression of someone who'd already calculated the fastest path out of the conversation. "Tattoo." "No kidding." He grinned at the guys on either side of him. Reyes and Tarbell, both already smiling because Kowalski's smiling meant something was coming. "What's it supposed to be? Looks like a dog had a seizure on your shoulder." Reyes snorted. Tarbell made the specific sound of a man who finds something funnier than he expected. Avery turned back to her locker. "A lot of people have trouble with art." "I like art fine." Kowalski leaned against the row of lockers, folding his arms. "I just don't usually see it on logistics girls." "What's the story? You get that after a hard night inventorying MREs?" She closed her locker door with a soft, final click. "I'll catch you at formation," she said, and walked out. That was it. No comeback. No visible irritation, just the sound of her boots on concrete and then the door swinging shut behind her, which somehow made it funnier to them. Or at least that was the story Kowalski told at dinner, louder than necessary, with the wolf seizure punchline landing well enough that it circulated through the lower platoon like mild currency. The kind of joke that isn't devastating but keeps getting repeated simply because the target never responds. Avery Collins, 26 years old, Colorado posting, 3 years in logistics. She never responded. Raven Ridge Army Base sat at roughly 7,400 feet in the Colorado Rockies, which meant the mornings arrived cold and stayed cold until almost noon, and the afternoon sky had a clarity that made distances deceptive. You could look across the base and misjudge where things were by a factor of 30%. Instructors mentioned this during land navigation training. Nobody fully understood it until they'd been embarrassed by it once. The base was mid-sized, functional, not a place that made the news. It processed 3 rotation cycles a year, ran combined arms exercises on the mountain terrain to the north, and had a logistics detachment that was considered competent but unglamorous. That was Avery's unit, the 224th Support Battalion, roughly 40 personnel, responsible for fuel management, ammunition accountability, and a range of supply functions that kept the combat arms elements running without anyone particularly thanking them for it. She had requested the posting herself. That detail was in her file, though nobody had looked at her file carefully enough to find it interesting. Her daily routine ran like a machine she had constructed and had no desire to modify. Reveille at 0530. PT from 0600 to 0700, which she completed without spectacle. She was fit, better than average for her MOS, but she didn't push herself visibly in front of others. Breakfast, brief, assignment work. She managed fuel resupply logs and coordinated with the armorer on small arms accountability, which mostly meant spreadsheets and radio check-ins and the occasional warehouse walk with a clipboard. She ate lunch alone or near alone by habit rather than policy. She was not overtly antisocial. She answered questions directly, acknowledged people in hallways, showed up to mandatory unit socials, and stood where she was supposed to stand. She simply didn't volunteer herself into conversations. People interpreted this differently. Kowalski and his orbit read it as arrogance wrapped in insecurity. Some of the women in her unit decided she was either painfully shy or thought she was better than them, and they couldn't determine which. Her direct supervisor, Staff Sergeant Brianna Holt, had decided in the first week that Collins was competent and low maintenance and left her mostly alone, which suited both of them. The tattoo had been visible to anyone who'd ever seen her in PT gear. The joke had been running for, by Kowalski's count, almost 8 months. Patient. It was Master Sergeant Owen Brooks who first noticed something that didn't fit the established narrative. Brooks ran the range qualification cycles for the battalion. He was 41, wide through the chest, a desert and Afghan veteran who moved like someone who'd spent years in places where moving quietly was survival mathematics. He had a habit of watching people from the edge of things rather than the center, which was how he'd noticed Avery Collins during the Q3 qualification day in late October. Live fire was mandatory, annual. Logistics personnel ran it the same as everyone else. M4 carbine, standard qualification distances, pop-up targets at 50, 100, 150, 200, and 300 meters. The scoring table ran from 0 to 40 possible hits. Expert was 36. Most support soldiers cleared marksman or sharpshooter and called it a day. Avery qualified expert, 38 out of 40. That wasn't unprecedented for a support soldier. It happened. Brooks noted it, watched her shoot the next iteration, and noted something different from expert. She shot flat. No adjustment between shots, no hesitation, no visible correction. The kind of stillness that was either exceptional naturalism or trained behavior so deep it had become invisible. Her breathing slowed before each shot in a pattern that had nothing to do with generic shooting instruction. He called her to the line after everyone else had rotated off. Collins. Sergeant. Where'd you learn to shoot? She looked at him directly, which some people avoided with Brooks. My grandfather. We hunted a lot growing up. What did you hunt? Deer mostly. Some elk. Wyoming backcountry. At 300 meters? She paused, one beat. He was old-fashioned about range. Brooks looked at her for a moment, without expression. You ever shoot formal competition? Bullseye? Any long-range program? No, Sergeant. He handed back her qualification card. You've got a natural gift. Thank you, Sergeant. She collected her card and cleared the range without looking back. Brooks watched her go and didn't say anything else that day. But he started paying attention in a way he hadn't before. The specific kind of attention that comes when something doesn't quite add up and you're not sure yet why. The tattoo up close was more complicated than a wolf. The wolf was the dominant image. Head forward, ears flat, rendered in a style that owed something to geometric design, but broke its own rules at the edges, bleeding into organic line work around the jaw and eye sockets. But the surrounding elements were the part that resisted casual reading. There were small numerals integrated into the background work, positioned like coordinates or reference numbers rather than dates. A horizontal line that might have been a horizon or a rifle barrel depending on the angle. Symbols that a person with military knowledge might associate with call signs or unit identifiers, but small enough and stylized enough to pass as decorative to anyone who wasn't looking. Nobody at Raven Ridge looked that closely. Kowalski had dubbed her Wolf Scratch by month 2, and that had stuck in the lower platoon. He used it to her face exactly once. She'd looked at him with an expression that wasn't anger, wasn't hurt, wasn't even particularly cold, just entirely empty of the reaction he wanted. And after that, he used it only behind her back, which was somehow more sustainable as a social practice. She overheard it twice that she showed no sign of registering. She overheard it, in fact, far more than twice. But she had learned before she was 22 that silence was a more durable shield than confrontation, and she hadn't changed that assessment. What the tattoo actually was, what every element in it meant, why the numerals were where they were, what the horizon line commemorated, that was information she held alone, and she had become so accustomed to holding it that some days she forgot she was holding anything at all, until she was alone, and then she remembered everything.
What?
The morning of November 14th began like every other morning, 0530, the automated tone in the barracks. Avery was already awake. She'd been awake since 0510, lying on her back in the dark watching the ceiling the way she'd done since she was 19 years old, and sleep had started being something she negotiated with rather than something that simply happened. She counted her breathing for a while. When the tone sounded, she got up. PT run was 6.2 kilometers along the northern perimeter trail. The temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky was the specific flat gray that precedes real cold. She ran alone at the front of the loosely organized group, which was her custom. Not aggressively, just pacing herself where she paced herself, which happened to be slightly ahead of the median. Kowalski made a comment about her back-of-the-pack position being at the front that didn't quite make logical sense, and Reyes laughed anyway. Breakfast was powdered eggs and decent coffee. She sat with a corporal named Yesenia Marsh, who was in the motor pool section and had approximately no interest in anything happening outside the motor pool section, which Avery found restful. They talked about the weather coming in, a low-pressure system that was supposed to push heavy snow into the northern approach by Thursday. Marsh was worried about a maintenance rotation being rescheduled. "They'll push it," Marsh said, soaking toast. "They always push it." "Probably," Avery agreed. "You have anything this week that'd get moved?" "Resupply coordination Thursday. It moves. I'll find out when they decide." Marsh nodded and went back to her toast. That was the texture of most mornings. Low temperature, low volume, moderate coffee. Avery signed 3 inventory forms before 0900, ran a radio check on the ammunition accountability net, and had just started reviewing a fuel drawdown report from the previous week when Staff Sergeant Holt appeared in the doorway of the supply office. "Collins?" Holt's expression was careful in a way that wasn't normal. "You're needed in the A Bay, now." "I'm in the middle of—" "Now, Collins." The A Bay was the briefing room attached to the battalion's operations center, a space used for planning cycles, command presentations, and on the rare occasions when something actual was happening, operational briefings. Avery had been in it 4 times since her posting, all for routine administrative presentations. This was not that. The room held 7 people when she walked in, which was already unusual. Captain Doreen Galvez, the battalion XO, stood at the front with her arms crossed and the expression of someone managing several things simultaneously. Master Sergeant Brooks was against the far wall. 2 people in civilian clothes occupied chairs near the window, and their body language broadcast federal law enforcement loudly enough that the lack of badges didn't change anything. A tactical radio had been set up on the briefing table, which was the detail that made Avery's stomach shift, and from it, intermittently, came the background noise of a live channel. Not traffic, just the low crackle of an open line. Nobody acknowledged her immediately when she entered, which was itself information. Galvez looked up. "Close the door." She did. "You know why you're here?" "No, Captain." "We'll get to that." Galvez turned to the radio. "Give me a current status." A voice came through, distant, compressed, but controlled. "CP7, we have 41 confirmed civilian holds, 2nd and 3rd floors of the structure. 4 armed individuals, possibly 5. Negotiation is offline. They cut at 0847. We are in a tactical hold pending option development." "Copy." Galvez muted the channel, turned back to the room. At 7:23 this morning, a group of armed extremists seized the Ashford Crossing Financial Tower in the city center. 11 floors, glass and steel construction, 41 civilians confirmed trapped, 2 suspected executed in the initial seizure. Local tactical units have been on scene since 0740. They have not been able to neutralize the threat. The 2 federal individuals didn't move. "The problem," Galvez continued, "is the building's position. The surrounding urban grid gives local SWAT exactly 2 viable approach vectors, both of which are covered. CQB entry has been assessed as high casualty. Air assets can't get angle on the interior positions because of the reflective glass and the sun orientation this time of day." She picked up a photograph from the table and held it up, an aerial image of the building and its surrounding blocks with notations in red marker. One possible solution is a long-range precision shot. There's an observation tower on the eastern perimeter of the municipal complex. Here, laser ranged this morning at 847 meters to the primary threat position on floor 3. Silence in the room. One of the federal agents, gray suit, close-cropped hair, expression like a man who had just listened to something impossible, said quietly, "Anything beyond 600 is outside confirmed capability for local units. Their senior marksman calls it unsurvivable odds for the hostages." "I know what their senior marksman says," Galvez said, and then looked at Avery. "Which brings us to why you're here, Specialist Collins." Avery met her eyes. "Captain, Master Sergeant Brooks filed a notation about your range performance in October. I pulled your full service record this morning." Galvez set down the photograph. "Your file prior to your logistics posting is flagged as restricted. I had to go up 2 levels to get a partial read, and what I got back was heavily redacted." She paused. "Do you want to explain the parts that were left visible?" The room was very quiet. The radio crackled softly. Avery stood still. She could feel Brooks watching from the wall, not with suspicion, but with the specific attention of someone who had already guessed the shape of an answer and was waiting to see if they were right. She thought about the morning she had signed the transfer request, the way she'd held the pen for almost a full minute before writing her name. The unit commander who hadn't tried to change her mind, who had only said, "You've earned whatever quiet you want." She had believed that sentence completely. She had built her life around it. "The file is restricted because I requested that it be," she said. 3 years ago. "Why?" She looked at the aerial photograph on the table, at the red notations, at the lines that led to a tower and a distance and a problem nobody in that room had solved yet. "I needed to not be what I was anymore," she said. "For a while." Galvez waited. Avery breathed out through her nose. "Before logistics. Before this posting. I served 3 rotations in a classified direct action element. Joint Task Force, no public designation. My primary function was long-range precision fire. Target ranges up to and including 1,400 meters depending on atmospheric conditions and weapon system." She stopped. 847 is not outside confirmed capability." The federal agent in the gray suit looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Galvez. Brooks hadn't moved from the wall, but something in his posture had changed. The particular stillness of a man who had suspected and was now certain. Galvez kept her eyes on Avery. "Specialist Collins, when you say long-range precision fire, what is the operational record attached to that function? I can't give you numbers without the classification being lifted." "I'm not asking for numbers. I'm asking for confirmation of capability." Avery looked at her. "I'm capable of the shot." "You're certain?" "I'm certain of the mechanics. Wind, light, distance. I need real-time data from the tower position, and I need to see the target geometry before I can confirm an actionable firing solution. But the distance is not the limiting factor." The federal agent leaned forward slightly. "Who can verify this?" "Nobody in this room," Avery said. "Everyone with direct knowledge of my operational history is in a part of the file you don't have access to." Another silence. Longer. Galvez picked up a pen and set it down again. "We have approximately 90 minutes before the incident commander on scene moves to a forced entry option with the assets he has. If that happens, the casualty projection is—" "I know what it is," Avery said. "Captain, with respect, if we're going to do this, we need to move in the next 40 minutes to have setup time at the tower." Galvez looked at her. "You're asking me to authorize a precision engagement at nearly a kilometer based on a service record I can't fully read, by a soldier I know as a logistics specialist." "I'm not asking you to authorize anything yet." Avery's voice was steady. "I'm asking you to get me to that tower so the decision has something real to be based on." The room held for several seconds. The radio crackled. Someone on the channel, distant, professional, was calling for updated positioning on a suspect near a stairwell. Brooks spoke for the first time since Avery had entered the room. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries. "Captain, I've watched a lot of shooters over 20 years. I don't recommend people who don't deserve recommending." He paused. "Get her to the tower." Galvez held for 3 more seconds, looking at Avery with the expression of someone making a calculation with incomplete variables. Then she picked up the radio handset. Bulge. 40 minutes later, a hard case arrived from Fort Carson by helicopter, a Barrett MRAD in .338. Lapua Magnum suppressed with a Schmidt and Bender 5 to 25 times 56 scope, already zeroed at 500 meters. It came with a federal armorer who handed the case to Avery without ceremony and watched her open it. She removed the upper receiver, checked the bolt face, looked at the bore. She ran her thumb along the suppressor coupling. She inspected the scope turrets and the diopter adjustment with the specific thoroughness of someone who had done this in conditions where a missed step had consequences she preferred not to describe. The armorer watched her for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "You've handled this system before. Similar configuration? MRAD or the predecessor?" She glanced at him. "Both." He said nothing after that. Neither did the small cluster of soldiers who had gathered at what they believed was a discreet distance but was not. Among them, hanging slightly back, was Kowalski. His expression was different from his usual expression, the specific face of a person whose available social models aren't working. Avery closed the case, latched it, and picked it up by the handle. "Let's go," she said to the escort team. The observation tower was a steel lattice structure, municipal construction, 34 meters tall, originally built for fire spotting and repurposed for communications relay. It had a platform at the top, roughly 4 meters square, enclosed on 3 sides by a steel railing. The wind at that height moved differently than at ground level. Not stronger, necessarily, but variable, shifting direction in 3 to 4 second cycles, with occasional 7-second dead spots that a trained observer could identify. Avery knew about the dead spots before she got to the top. She knew because she was already measuring the wind on the way up. She assembled the rifle on the platform. It took her 3 minutes and 14 seconds. She knew because the escort team's senior officer, a tactical coordinator named Lieutenant Whitman, was timing her on his watch because he had nothing else useful to do, and the action of watching a timer was better than standing still with his hands at his sides. He didn't say the time out loud, but his expression said it had been faster than expected. She deployed the bipod, settled into position on a folded tarp she'd brought up in her kit, and put her eye to the scope. The building swam into view. Glass and steel, lower floors obscured by the angle of adjacent structures, the third floor coming into resolution in the 25 power setting. She turned the magnification ring. The image sharpened. She could see glare off the interior lights, the vertical shadow patterns of window frames, movement behind the glass that was indistinct at this second. She clicked the turret for elevation and began working the math. "I need current wind data at ground level on the target building, cardinal direction, and speed. And I need someone to confirm the floor geometry. How deep is the third floor from the exterior glass?" Whitman was already on the radio. The wind data came back in 40 seconds, 6 to 9 knots, variable, predominant southwest. The floor depth confirmation took longer, 2 minutes while someone on scene got eyes on building schematics, and came back at 8.2 meters from exterior glass to the reported position of the primary threat actor. She adjusted the scope reticle. She breathed, slowed, breathed again. Through the glass, at 847 meters, with morning light at a low westward angle, she could see a shape. Standing. Moving periodically, pacing, the specific movement pattern of someone who was alert but not yet anticipating an exterior threat. A weapon was visible, raised at carrying angle, not at the shoulder. Beside the shape, further into the room, 2 other hostages. Seated, not standing. A third figure that might be a second armed individual or a hostage. The angle wasn't giving her enough clarity. "I need confirmation on individual identification," she said into her headset. "I have a primary at the floor 3 position, southwest interior. I have 2 to 3 additional bodies, while I need someone inside the building loop to confirm armed versus non-combatant." The answer came from the incident command post, relayed through Whitman. "1 armed, confirmed southwest interior. Second armed individual is northeast stairwell, currently stationary. Third armed individual, position uncertain, believed floor 2. She shifted slightly. Recalculated. 847 meters, 6 to 9 knots variable southwest. The point 338 Lapua at this distance would shed approximately 47 inches of bullet drop below bore axis, compensated for in the turret adjustment she'd already made. Wind drift at 6 knots would push roughly 14 inches at this distance, at 9 knots, closer to 22. The variable was the variable. She would need to catch a clean dead spot in the wind cycle, fire before the next shift, and trust the compensation she'd built into the hold-off. Her heart rate was 58 beats per minute. She was aware of this not because she was monitoring it, but because she could feel it in the slight pulse against the rifle's stock, and she had trained herself over years to read that pulse the way other people read instruments. Below and to the northwest, she could hear, faintly through the headset, the voice of the incident commander cycling through tactical options with his team. Forced entry was being discussed. The timeline was compressing. Someone on the team was pushing for a smoke deployment to create a cover approach. Whitman crouched beside her. "What's your assessment?" "The shot is clean if I get a dead wind window," she said without moving her eye from the scope. "I need the assault team to be positioned and ready to enter on the shot. There will be no delay between my engagement and the building entry. If there's a second armed individual on the northeast stairwell, the entry team needs to be prepared to address that target immediately on breach. I'll relay. And I need authorization." He straightened and went to the radio. She stayed in position, breathing, watching the movement behind the glass at 847 meters. The figure paced, stopped, paced again. She found the wind cycle without thinking about it. 3 seconds southwest, slight pause, 4 seconds of relative stillness, repeat. The pause was the window. 4 seconds was more than enough. The radio crackled. A voice she didn't recognize, senior enough to be giving final authorization, said, "Raven Ridge element, you're cleared to engage on your call. Assault teams confirm ready. How copy?" Whitman looked at her. She didn't respond verbally. She put her finger inside the trigger guard and rested it, not pressed, rested, against the curved steel. The figure behind the glass stopped pacing. Avery watched the wind through the scope reticle's wind dots, feeling the shifts she could no longer see, but had spent enough years learning to know without seeing. She felt the pause begin. She waited for one more breath. Then Kowalski's voice came over the shared channel, patched in from the A-bay where most of the unit had apparently gathered around a speaker. Before anyone could stop him, sharp and involuntary, the sound of a man whose disbelief had finally broken through his radio discipline. Wait, that's Collins up there. The logistics girl? That's who we're—" Someone cut the channel. But the word girl hung in the air above the tower platform for exactly 1 second before the wind swallowed it. Avery Collins did not move, did not flinch, did not look away from the glass. Her breathing slowed to nothing, and her finger found the trigger. The shot broke the morning open. Not loud, suppressed. The Barrett's report compressed to a hard mechanical crack that traveled outward and dissolved before most people on the ground could locate its source. But the effect was immediate and absolute. Through the scope, Avery watched the primary threat actor drop in the space between one frame and the next. No drama, no backward stumble, just there and then not there, and she was already cycling the bolt before the brass cleared the ejection port. Second shot. Northeast stairwell position. She'd pre-calculated the angle shift, 11 degrees left, minor elevation drop, same wind compensation. The entry team was already moving. She had 4 seconds before they'd be in the building and the geometry would change. She fired. Through the radio came the compressed sound of boots on a hard floor, someone breathing fast but controlled, and then a voice, the entry team lead, clipped and professional, calling, "2 down, floor 3 clear, moving to 2. She was already scanning. The third individual, floor 2, position uncertain. That was the variable nobody had locked down. She swept the lower windows, looking for movement, shape, anything that resolved into a target profile. The morning light had shifted slightly, sun crawling higher, washing the lower glass in a shallow glare that made reading interior shapes harder. "Floor 2, contact." The radio cut out for 1 second, then, "Handled. Hostages secure. All floors, no additional armed. I say again, building is clear." Avery kept her eye on the scope for 3 more seconds. watching, making sure. Then she lifted her head and looked at the city below her. Ashford Crossing spread out at the foot of the tower, ordinary and oblivious in the way cities are during the minutes after something catastrophic has just been stopped. Traffic moving on distant streets, a bus pulling away from a corner stop, the thin winter sunlight catching the glass faces of buildings that didn't know what had almost happened inside one of them. She became aware of Whitman standing behind her only because she heard him exhale, the specific exhale of a man releasing pressure he'd been holding for a long time without noticing. "Building is secure," he said, mostly to himself. Then he put the radio to his mouth. "Command, Raven Ridge Element. Confirm 3 engagements, all hostile, 0 civilian casualties. Tower is standing down." "Copy, Raven Ridge." "Outstanding work." Whitman looked at her. She was already breaking down the rifle. Bolt out, receiver separated, scope protected. Her movements were the same as when she'd assembled it. No faster, no slower. No visible emotion in her hands. "Collins." She didn't look up. "Sir." "That was—" He stopped, started again. "I don't have the right word for that." "You don't need one," she said. "Hand me the case." "What?" The helicopter back to Raven Ridge took 23 minutes. Avery sat against the bulkhead with the rifle case between her feet and her eyes on the floor, and she did not speak, and nobody spoke to her, which was the right call by everyone in that aircraft. What she was doing during those 23 minutes was not thinking about the shots. She was past thinking about the shots. They were already filed into the same part of her memory where everything operational went, sealed and categorized and accessible only on her own terms. What she was actually doing was something closer to grieving, though she would not have used that word, and the thing she was grieving was the particular quietness of the last 3 years. She had built that quietness carefully, had chosen Raven Ridge specifically because it was unremarkable, because the logistics posting meant her name never appeared in anything more sensitive than a fuel accountability report, because the mountains and the altitude and the cold mornings were things she could put her attention into without being asked to produce anything that cost her the way the other thing had cost her. 3 deployments, 41 confirmed engagements, 14 months in a unit that didn't officially exist and therefore could not officially congratulate her or account for what the work had done to the texture of her sleep. She had been 23 years old the first time. She had been 23 and extraordinarily good at something that she had not yet fully understood the dimensions of. By 25, she understood the dimensions. By 25, she had sat with the unit psychologist 4 times, and lied to him twice, and told him the partial truth twice, and known, with the specific clarity that comes after enough operational cycles, that she needed to stop before stopping became impossible. The transfer request had taken 4 drafts. The final version was 1 paragraph. Her unit commander had read it and not spoken for a while, and then he had said, "You've earned whatever quiet you want." She had believed that completely. Now the quiet was over and she was sitting in a helicopter with a Barrett MRA-D between her feet, and below them, Raven Ridge was coming into view through the window, and she could already see the cluster of people outside the A-Bay doors, which meant word had traveled ahead of the aircraft, which meant everything that came next was going to be everything she had specifically arranged her life to avoid. She breathed through her nose, breathed out, picked up the rifle case and held it in her lap. The helicopter touched down. The debrief lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than she wanted and shorter than she expected. It happened in the A-Bay with the doors closed, which meant only essential personnel, Galvez, Brooks, the 2 federal agents who had introduced themselves at some point as Harmon and Cruz, and a JAG officer named Captain Presley, who had been flown in from Peterson and seemed deeply unhappy about the timeline. Whitman sat in the corner taking notes. They went through the engagement sequence 3 times. Shot 1, shot 2, shot 3. Timing, targeting confirmation, decision process, communication with the entry team. Avery answered everything directly and without embellishment, using the clinical language she'd learned in a context where clinical language was a professional standard, and she watched the JAG officer's expression shift from skepticism through discomfort to something approaching reluctant acceptance. Harmon, the gray suit, older of the 2 federal agents, had done his homework between the tower and the debrief room. He had made calls. Whatever came back from those calls was visible now in the way he looked at her, which was not the way he'd looked at her 4 hours earlier. Specialist Collins, he said during a pause in the tactical sequence review. The unit you're describing, you were attached for how long? I can't confirm details without the classification being appropriately lifted. I'm not asking for details. I'm asking for duration. Approximately 14 months over 3 rotations. And the transfer to logistics was voluntary. Yes. For mental health reasons. She met his eyes. For personal reasons. Cruz, younger, less senior, taking notes on a tablet, looked up. The post-operational psych evaluations in the accessible portion of your record show what they show, Avery said. I made a decision and I stand by it. If you have a concern about my current fitness, the base physician is available. Cruz glanced at Harmon. Harmon made a small gesture that meant, let it go. Galvez had been sitting at the head of the table with her arms crossed since the beginning, and she had spoken less than anyone, which, in Avery's experience, was not a sign of disengagement, but of the opposite. When she finally spoke, her voice was level and without particular inflection, which made it harder to read than anger would have been. Why didn't you disclose this when you arrived at Raven Ridge? I wasn't required to. The transfer was processed with a need-to-know restriction on my previous assignment history. You weren't required to, but you could have. Yes, Captain. And you didn't. No, Captain. Because you wanted to be left alone. Avery held her gaze. Because I wanted to do my job without my job being something other than my job. Galvez was quiet for a moment. Your job today was resupply accountability. Yes, Captain. Instead, you engaged 3 armed hostage takers at 847 meters through a glass exterior under variable wind conditions with 0 civilian casualties. Yes, Captain. Another pause. Galvez looked at the table, then back at Avery. I don't know whether to write you up or recommend you for a commendation. With respect, Captain, you don't have to do either today. Something moved across Galvez's face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. She looked at Brooks. Master Sergeant, your read. Brooks had been the quietest person in the room, which was consistent with everything Avery knew about him. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the range in October, the attentive stillness of someone adding new information to a model he'd been building for a while. She performed exactly as her record indicates she's capable of, he said. Whether we do anything about that is an administrative question. The mission question is settled. The JAG officer cleared his throat. There will need to be a formal review period. The engagement, while apparently successful, involved a non-standard authorization chain and a personnel utilization that doesn't fall neatly within... Captain Presley, Harmon said quietly. 3 hostages would be dead right now. The formal review period will reach whatever conclusion it reaches. Let's not front-load the conclusion. Presley pressed his mouth together and went back to his notes. The debrief wrapped at 15:43. Avery was told to remain on base pending review, which she had expected, and was released to her quarters, which she had also expected. She walked across the base in the late afternoon light, which had gone thin and gold the way Colorado light does in November, and she kept her eyes straight ahead, and she pretended not to notice that people were looking at her. The word had traveled faster than she'd come back. That was the thing about a closed military base. There was no outside to dissipate information into. Everything circulated inward, word of mouth moving through a population of a few hundred people the way water moved through a closed loop, picking up detail and distortion in equal measure. By the time she crossed the parade ground, the version of events that most people had was approximately 60% accurate and 100% inflated, which in her experience was the standard ratio. She heard fragments, didn't seek them out, couldn't avoid them. 3 shots, they said. 3. At almost a kilometer. Logistics girl, I'm telling you, I almost spit out my coffee when Whitman told me. Classified unit, nobody even knows the name of it. She kept walking. Head level, pace even. The way she'd learned to move through spaces where people were looking at her. Not fast enough to signal discomfort, not slow enough to invite engagement. She was almost to the barracks when Kowalski appeared. He came around the corner of the motor pool building and nearly walked into her, and she sidestepped automatically, and he pulled up short, and for a moment they were just standing there in the narrow gap between the building and the vehicle row with 3 feet of cold air between them. His face was doing something complicated. She'd seen variations of it before, in different people. The specific rearrangement of features that happens when a person's confident model of someone else collapses and they haven't yet built a replacement. It looked like discomfort, but it was actually the face of a particular kind of embarrassment, the kind that doesn't come from being caught doing something wrong, but from realizing the wrong has been ongoing for long enough that catching is almost beside the point. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Collins." She waited. Everyone heard what happened, at the tower." He shifted his weight. "I didn't know." "No. He stopped, scratched the back of his neck. "The tattoo thing, the stuff I said. What about it?" "I'm sorry, okay? I didn't know." She looked at him for a moment, not cold, not warm, just looking. "You didn't need to know," she said. "That's the point." She stepped around him and kept walking, and he didn't follow, and she heard him exhale behind her. The sound of a man who had expected more than he got, which was its own kind of lesson, though she wasn't in the business of teaching it. The barracks room was empty when she got there. Her bunkmate, a private named Osei, who worked in the battalion communications section, was on duty until 1800. Avery sat on the edge of her bunk and did not remove her jacket and did not turn on the light, and the room was blue-gray in the late afternoon shadow. She was tired in the way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She could run 10 kilometers in that moment if required. What she couldn't do, right now, was think about the next week without a weight settling somewhere behind her sternum. The classification on her record would shift. That was inevitable. Harmon and Cruz would put in the appropriate requests. Galvez would push from her end, and the restricted notation would be lifted at least partially to allow for the formal review. Once that happened, the information would exist in a space where it could be read by anyone with sufficient clearance and a reason to look, which was a different thing from the tightly controlled vault it had lived in for 3 years. People she'd served with would hear. People who'd trained her. People she'd deliberately moved away from, not because she was ashamed of anything, but because the distance was part of how she'd rebuilt herself, and the rebuild was fragile in ways she hadn't fully admitted even to herself. She looked at the tattoo, pulled her sleeve up to the shoulder, sat in the blue-gray light, and looked at it without the deflecting distance of other people's mockery to put between herself and what it actually was. Each numeral encoded a name. There were 6. The wolf's eye was the 7th, which she had designed differently because the 7th was different. Not a loss to enemy fire or operational circumstance, but to the slower damage that didn't get memorialized officially, the kind that looked like a personal decision and was in fact a consequence of years of what they'd all been asked to absorb without showing the weight. She knew all 7 names the way she knew her own breathing. She didn't need to look at the ink to access them, but there was something about the act of looking that she returned to in moments like this one, a kind of forcing function, making herself see the weight directly rather than carrying it only as sensation. 7 names, 3 deployments, 14 months, 8 seconds this morning. She pulled her sleeve back down and lay back on the bunk with her boots still on and her eyes on the ceiling and let the afternoon light finish changing without moving. Brooks knocked at 17:20. She'd heard him coming, not because his footsteps were distinctive, but because she'd been in a state of low-level alertness since the helicopter landed and she hadn't quite let it go, which was itself information about what the morning had done to her, what it had switched back on without asking permission. "Come in," she said, without sitting up. He opened the door, assessed the situation, her on the bunk, lights off, boots on, and came in anyway, which she respected. He dragged the desk chair to the center of the room and sat down with his elbows on his knees. "You okay?" "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." She sat up, looked at him. "I'm tired." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "You want me to say something reassuring, or you want me to talk straight?" "Straight." "Galvez is going to fight for you. The federal loop is closing on your file tonight or tomorrow. Harmon's got the contacts and he's motivated. I could hear it in how he talked about the engagement. The review period is probably 30 to 45 days, and at the end of it, you're going to have options. He paused. Probably options you don't want. Probably? You going to tell me why you really transferred? She looked at him. He met it without flinching, without the anxious quality people usually had when they pushed against her silence. He was asking because he actually wanted to know, not because he was collecting information for another use. I was good at it, she said. That's the short version. I was very good at it, and I did it for long enough that I couldn't tell anymore whether I was doing it because I chose to or because I was what I was. There's a difference. I needed to know the difference again. He sat with that for a moment. And logistics gave you the difference. Logistics gave me a fuel report and a radio check and a clipboard. Nobody died if I made a mistake. She paused. I wanted that. I wanted something I could do well and then put down at the end of the day. You put it down, and then this morning came along. Yeah. Are you angry? She considered the question honestly, which it deserved. No, I don't think so. If I'd stayed hidden and those hostages died because I didn't speak up, I couldn't have lived with that. She looked at the tattoo again, reflexively, through the jacket sleeve she couldn't see through. I'm just not sure what happens now. Brooks nodded slowly. You don't have to decide that tonight. I know. He stood up, put the chair back by the desk. At the door, he stopped. Collins. Sergeant, for what it's worth. He didn't look sentimental. He wasn't built for sentimental, but his voice carried something real. What you did this morning took more than the shot. It took deciding to be seen again. That's the harder thing. She didn't answer. He didn't wait for one. The door closed behind him. She lay back on the bunk. Outside, through the thin wall, she could hear the base settling into its evening routine. The mess hall opening, someone's radio playing low music in the next room, a vehicle starting up somewhere near the motor pool. Ordinary sounds, the kind she had chosen specifically and deliberately and with full understanding of what she was choosing them instead of. She thought about the dead wind window, the 4 seconds of stillness in the cycling air, the way she'd felt the pause begin before she could consciously measure it, the knowledge arriving in her body ahead of her mind. Some things, once built, did not disassemble. She had known that when she transferred. She had hoped the knowing would be enough. She was 37 minutes away from what would turn out to be the most disruptive conversation of her time at Raven Ridge, though she didn't know that yet, lying there in the dark with her boots on and the evening sounds of the base moving around her like water around a stone. What she knew was this. She had been invisible for 3 years, and she was not invisible anymore. What she didn't know yet was who had been watching from before the beginning, and why the tattoo had been the thing they were looking for all along. The knock came at 17:57. Not Brooks this time. The cadence was different, 2 sharp raps with a knuckle rather than the measured single knock of someone who'd spent decades learning how to enter spaces without disrupting them. Avery was already sitting up, boots still on, the room fully dark now except for the thin orange line of the exterior security light bleeding under the door. Collins? A voice she didn't recognize. Female, clipped, the kind of voice that had learned to project authority into small spaces. I need 2 minutes. She reached over and clicked on the desk lamp. It's open. The woman who came through the door was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact and straight-backed, wearing a civilian jacket over a collared shirt that was too pressed for someone who'd traveled casually. No rank visible, but rank was in everything else. The way she moved through the doorway without asking permission to enter fully. The way her eyes swept the room once and then settled on Avery with the specific attention of someone who had already reviewed everything they needed to review and was now simply confirming the final variable. She had a lanyard around her neck with an ID that she didn't display. Major Dana Rist, she said, retired, currently assigned as a senior assessor with a federal talent coordination office, which is a title that means approximately nothing, and I say that because the actual title is classified and I don't want to spend the next 10 minutes on clearance verification paperwork. She pulled the desk chair out and sat in it like she owned it. Sit down, specialist. This isn't a formal meeting. Avery sat back on the edge of the bunk. You're the 37 minutes. Rist paused. What? Nothing. What do you want? Rist looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating slightly. I've been following your file for about 18 months, passively. The restriction flagged in our system when you transferred, and we note those kinds of flags when the underlying record suggests a capability profile worth monitoring. She crossed one knee over the other. This morning confirmed what the flag suggested. I'm not interested in going back. I haven't offered anything. You drove or flew here inside 12 hours of the engagement. You're not here to tell me you've been watching my file. Something in Rist's expression shifted. A fractional movement that might have been approval, might have been calculation. Fair. Here's the direct version. There's an active situation. It began developing 6 weeks ago, and it's been escalating. It involves a network that operates across 3 mountain states, uses legitimate commercial infrastructure as cover, and has been responsible for at least 4 confirmed deaths that we can attribute internally but cannot prosecute publicly. We've been building the intelligence picture, and we're close. What we don't have is a precision capability at the operational level. She paused. What we mean by that is the kind of human judgment that can't be programmed and can't be replaced by a drone asset. We need someone who can read a situation at distance and make decisions in compressed time with incomplete information and not break. Avery looked at her. That's a very tidy description of what I spent 3 years trying to stop being. I know. And you're here anyway. People are going to die if this network isn't disrupted in the next 3 to 4 weeks. That's not a recruitment pitch. That's the operational timeline. Rist's voice was flat, not cold, but stripped of softener, and Avery appreciated that even as she resented it. I'm not going to tell you it's your responsibility, because it isn't. I'm not going to tell you only you can do this, because that's probably not technically true. What I can tell you is that you're the best option we've identified with a viable current location profile and a known capability ceiling. Known from a file you can't fully read. Known from this morning. Rist looked at her directly. 847 meters, variable crosswind, 3 engagements, 8 seconds, 0 civilian casualties. I watched the tower camera footage on the flight here. I've been in this work for 22 years, Collins. I know what I'm looking at. Avery was quiet for a moment. Through the wall, the low music from the next room had stopped. The bass was moving into its nighttime rhythm, quieter, reduced. I'm under a review restriction. Galvez has me on base. The review clears tomorrow morning. Harmon's paperwork went through at 16:30. Rist said it without flourish, just information. I coordinated with his office before I boarded the flight. Of course you did. I'm not trying to trap you. I'm telling you the practical situation. The practical situation is that you've cleared my review period before I even had a chance to decide what I want to do with it. Avery kept her voice level. That's not coordination. That's managing someone else's options without asking. Rist was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. The pause of someone who is choosing to accept a valid point rather than root around it. You're right, she said. That was premature. I'm sorry. She said it plainly, without the apologetic inflation that made apologies feel like negotiations. I made an assumption about your willingness that I hadn't confirmed. That was wrong process. Avery looked at her. What's the timeline for the operational decision? 72 hours before the window starts closing significantly. And if I say no, then I go back and we work with what we have. Rist stood up, returned the chair to the desk with the same ownership she'd moved it with. I'm staying at the Ashford Crossing Marriott tonight. Captain Galvez has the contact number. She moved toward the door, then stopped without turning around. The 4 confirmed deaths I mentioned. 2 of them were under 30. 1 was a woman about your age. A pause. I'm not saying that to manipulate you. I'm saying it because you'll read the brief if you say yes, and I'd rather you know the weight of it before you decide. She opened the door, and the exterior light washed in, and she was gone. Avery sat in the half-dark and listened to the door settle closed and thought about the 4 seconds of dead-wind stillness she'd waited for that morning, and how she had known it was coming before she could measure it, and how that kind of knowing was not something you chose to develop and not something you could choose to stop having once it was there. She didn't sleep. She lay on the bunk and watched the ceiling change as the exterior lights cycled through their scheduled patterns, and she went through the same circuit she'd gone through in various forms over the past 3 years. The operational arguments versus the personal cost, the capability she had versus the life she was trying to build around not using it, the specific weight of knowing she could help and choosing not to. She had made that calculation before. She had made it cleanly, with full information, and it had been the right call. The transfer had been right. The 3 years had been right. The trouble was that the calculation didn't stop running just because you'd made a decision. It kept running in the background, and mornings like this one fed it new variables, and eventually the output changed whether you were ready for it or not. At 200, she got up, put on her jacket, and went to the motor pool. The motor pool at night was one of the quieter places on base. The vehicles ranked in their bays under low lighting, the overnight duty private usually somewhere near the office with a thermos and a phone. Avery had found, over 3 years, that the smell of motor oil and cold metal was one of the more reliable things for settling her mind. She couldn't have explained why. She'd stopped trying. She walked the vehicle rows for 20 minutes, hands in her jacket pockets, breathing the cold air. One of the Humvees had a side panel with fresh rust forming along the wheel arch. She made a note to log it in the morning. Functional habit, useful, requiring nothing. She stopped at the end of the last row and leaned against a support column and looked at the wolf tattoo. In the motor pool light, fluorescent, greenish, unforgiving, the line work looked different than it did in daylight. Starker. The wolf's eye that was the 7th name looked back at her from the ink with the particular quality of an image that carried meaning the ink itself could not contain. She thought about the woman about her age. She thought about 3 shots in 8 seconds. She thought about the quiet she had built and what it had cost and what it had given her, and whether those 2 things still balanced. At 0300, she went back to the barracks and lay down and, unexpectedly, slept. She told Galvez at 0730. Galvez listened without interrupting, which was how she handled most things. And when Avery finished, she was quiet for a moment with her hands flat on the desk surface. "You're sure," Galvez said. "I'm not sure about anything except that the alternative is worse." "That's different from being sure." "I know." Galvez looked out the window at the parade ground where a morning formation was just breaking up. Soldiers dispersing in the cold, breath visible, the ordinary choreography of a base waking up. "The review cleared this morning. You're not restricted." She turned back. "Technically, this conversation doesn't need to happen." "I know that too. I wanted you to know anyway." Something in Galvez's expression adjusted. Not softened exactly. She wasn't a soft expression person, but something in it acknowledged the gesture for what it was. "Brooks is going to say I should have done more to keep you here," Galvez said. "Tell him I made the call." "Which I did." Galvez nodded once. "Watch yourself, Collins." "Yes, Captain." Diartant. The briefing was in a rented conference room in the Ashford Crossing Marriott at 0930, which was a setting so aggressively ordinary that Avery found it mildly absurd. Beige carpet, a whiteboard with the previous tenant's meeting agenda still visible in faded marker, a coffee station with 3 varieties of creamer. Rist was already there, along with 2 other people who hadn't been introduced at Raven Ridge. A heavy-set man named Pollard, who ran technical support for the operation, and a lean, watchful woman who gave her name as Reese and no other designation, and whose eyes tracked every door and window in a way that told Avery everything she needed to know about Reese's professional background. Pollard had the briefing materials. Physical copies, not digital, which meant this was the classification tier where the risk of network interception was considered higher than the inconvenience of printed documents. Avery read through the package in 18 minutes while the others drank coffee. Nobody tried to walk her through it. Rist had apparently assessed correctly that Collins did not need material explained to her. The network was called internally Harrogate, which was a designation that appeared nowhere public and told her it was task force nomenclature rather than an agency acronym. It operated primarily across Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, using a legitimate logistics and freight business, 2 warehouse facilities, a registered transportation company, roughly 40 employees who were either participants or unwitting, as the structural shell for what was underneath. Underneath was a combination of commodity trafficking and a tier of operations that the brief described as infrastructure interference, a deliberately vague term that the attached appendix clarified with enough specific detail to make her put the appendix down for a moment before picking it back up. 4 deaths. The brief was precise about them. 2 in Wyoming, attributed to what had been ruled accidental industrial incidents. 1 in Colorado, listed as an unsolved homicide with an active investigation that had been stalled for 11 months. 1 in Montana, classified as a missing persons case that the task force internally assessed as fatal. 2 were under 30. The woman her age was the Colorado homicide. Her name had been Sarah Cord. She was 27, had worked as a county environmental inspector, and had documented anomalies in one of Harrogate's warehouse operations 6 weeks before her death. The brief included a photograph, professional, from what appeared to be a county employee ID, a woman with direct eyes and dark hair, and the particular expression of someone who took their work seriously enough to not perform casualness in their ID photo. Avery set the brief down, picked up the coffee she hadn't touched, drank some of it. "The operational ask," she said. Rist took the lead. "Harrogate has a primary coordination figure. He runs the logistics shell and is believed to personally authorize anything that crosses into the interference tier. We've been unable to build a prosecutable case because the structural insulation is well designed. He stays 3 layers away from anything actionable. What we need is a direct observation capability at a specific event." She put a map on the table. "In 14 days, Harrogate is running what appears externally to be a regional freight industry conference at a private property outside Larimer County. We believe it's a coordination meeting between the primary and 3 to 4 secondary network figures. If we can position an observation asset with direct line capability to that location, you need eyes and confirmation, not a firing solution." Rist paused. "Primarily. But the authorization exists for escalated action if the situation develops in a direction that creates immediate threat to life." Avery looked at the map. The property was marked, a private ranch, large, well-positioned to be defensible and to create observation challenges for standard surveillance approaches. The terrain around it was familiar in character if not specifically. High elevation, mixed forest, and open ridge, the kind of ground that punished unprepared movement and rewarded people who knew how to read it. "What's the observation window?" "Maximum 6 to 8 hours. The meeting is believed to run from late afternoon into the evening." "Distance from the nearest viable hide to the primary structure?" Pollard pulled up a satellite image on a physical printout. Avery leaned over it. "Here," she said, pointing. "This ridgeline. What's the laser range to the main building's south face?" Pollard checked a reference sheet. "We estimated approximately 620 to the primary meeting space based on architectural review." "In November, at elevation, what's the prevailing wind direction on that ridge at late afternoon?" "We haven't—" "You need to get that." She straightened up. "I also need a height assessment on the ridgeline, approach route, natural cover, sight lines. I need that before I can confirm position viability." "We can have that in 72 hours, Reese said. It was the first thing she'd said in the meeting. Her voice was even and specific in the way of someone who was accustomed to making logistical promises she intended to keep. Avery looked at Rist. "I have conditions." "Tell me." "I work with a 2-person team minimum. Not strangers. I need to know the field partner's background before I agree to the pairing. I make all tactical calls in the field without override from a command post. If I say abort, we abort. No discussion." She paused. "And I want full access to the Harrogate file, not the abbreviated operational brief. I want to understand what I'm walking into." Rist looked at her for a moment. "The full file is—" "I know what it is. That's why I'm asking for it." Another pause. Rist glanced at Reese, who gave a small nod. "Done," Rist said. "On the field partner, Reese will work with you directly. She's been on Harrogate for 4 months, former MARSOC." Avery looked at Reese. Reese looked back at her with the calibrated steadiness of someone who has been assessed by capable people before and is neither threatened nor impressed by the process. "You comfortable with the terrain profile?" Avery asked her. "I've worked worse." "Mountain cold is different from desert cold." "I know what mountain cold is." Avery held her gaze for one more second, then looked back at the map. "All right." Wrist let out a breath that was too controlled to be relief but was in the same neighborhood. We'll need you to stay in Ashford Crossing for the prep period. We have a secured accommodation. I need to go back to Raven Ridge first. For what? Avery picked up the photograph of Sarah Cord, looked at it for a moment and placed it back on the table face up, where it would stay in the frame of her eye line for the rest of the meeting. Personal effects, she said, and I need to tell Brooks in person. She was back at Raven Ridge by 1400. Brooks was in the range office reviewing the quarterly qualification reports that had been stalled during yesterday's events. He didn't look up when she came in, but he'd heard her coming and he moved the papers to the side without being asked. She told him the shape of it, not the classified details, just the shape. A follow-on tasking, time-limited. Her decision. He listened with his elbows on the desk and his hands clasped and his eyes on the middle distance, which was how he listened to things that required him to organize his response before it arrived. How long? He said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. You come back after. She paused. That's the plan. He heard the pause. She knew he heard it because of the almost imperceptible change in the set of his jaw, not tightening, just acknowledging. The plan, he repeated. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, picked up one of the qualification reports and set it down again without looking at it. You know what I think? You think I'm not ready? I think you spent 3 years putting yourself back together after something that cost you considerably, and I think 24 hours is not enough recovery time from having that something reactivated before someone shows up and asks you to activate it on purpose. He looked at her directly. That's what I think. You're not wrong. And you're going anyway. Yes. He nodded slowly, accepting it rather than agreeing with it. What do you need from me? She pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket and set it on the desk, a brief, handwritten list. Sign out paperwork, and I need a character reference for the operational file. Rist's office will contact you. He picked up the paper and read it. This is a short list. It's a short trip. He folded it again and put it in his desk drawer. Collins? Sergeant? Don't let whoever's running this decide when you abort. You decide. Already in the conditions. Good. He picked the qualification report back up. Watch your back on that ridge line. Mountain wind in November is not what people expect until they're already in it. She almost smiled. You know about the ridge line? I know about terrain profiles, and I know what 400 meters of elevation does to wind behavior. He turned a page without looking at her. Go. She packed in 30 minutes. The room was small enough that 30 minutes was sufficient, and fast enough to feel intentional. She brought the things she always brought on extended fieldwork, layering system, navigation tools, the specific personal kit that she had kept precisely current for 3 years out of habit, so old she'd stopped noticing it. She brought the photograph of her grandfather's property in Wyoming, not because she needed it, but because she'd always brought it, and the habit was one of the ones she chose to keep. She did not bring anything from the bottom drawer of her desk, which was where she kept the folded personnel report from her last operational debrief, the one she'd read 4 times in the first year and not opened since. That document was not relevant to this assignment, and she knew with the clarity of someone who had done this kind of work before that bringing irrelevant weight into the field was the kind of mistake that didn't always announce itself until too late. She was in the hallway with her bag when Kowalski appeared for the second time in 24 hours, this time with Reyes and Tarbell behind him, which meant it had the unplanned quality of people who had heard she was leaving and hadn't entirely organized their response to that information. Kowalski's face had the same complicated expression as yesterday, maybe more settled now, like a man who'd spent the night working out what he actually wanted to say and arrived at something that was at least partially honest. You shipping out? He said. Temporarily. He glanced at the bag, looked back at her. We heard you took the tasking. Where'd you hear that? Base gossips faster than the radio net. You know that. She did know that. She'd been relying on it for 3 years to keep track of what the ambient unit mood was, without having to engage with it directly. Reyes, who had never been the instigator but had laughed at everything Kowalski started, was studying the floor. Tarbell had his hands in his pockets and was looking at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. Kowalski said, I meant what I said yesterday. About the tattoo. I know you did. I just... He stopped. Tried again. I feel like I should say something else, but I don't know what it is. Avery looked at him. He was 24, she knew, from Wyoming originally, the second of 3 kids, had enlisted because his older brother had, and there wasn't much else pulling in a clear direction. She knew this because she paid attention to the people around her even when she gave no sign of it, which was its own kind of habit from the operational years. You don't have to say anything, she said. Just don't make the same call next time. He nodded. Yeah, okay. He reached out and she thought for a moment he was going to offer a handshake, but he stopped short of that and just left his hand at his side and said, Stay safe out there. I'll try. Reyes looked up. We're glad you were up there, he said quietly, without the usual social scaffolding of a guy who was used to processing things through Kowalski's lead. Yesterday, for what it's worth. She held his gaze for a moment. It's worth something. She walked down the hallway and out the barracks door into the cold November afternoon, and the base spread around her in the low winter light, ordinary and functional, and hers for the past 3 years in the specific sense that a person can own a place through daily presence and accumulated routine. She stopped at the edge of the parking area and turned back once. The barracks, the motor pool across the lot, the range building at the far end, the peaks above the northern perimeter, snow-capped, white against a sky that had gone thin blue in the way Colorado skies went thin blue in late fall, clear and cold and achingly clear. She looked at it for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she shouldered her bag and walked to the vehicle. Reese was already in the passenger seat, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that certain things could not be rushed and that trying was its own kind of inefficiency. She said nothing when Avery got in and started the engine. She looked out the passenger window at the mountains. They drove south through the Raven Ridge Gate without ceremony, the guard checking Avery's new clearance documentation with a professionalism that made the 3-year ritual of daily badge swipes feel suddenly like something from a different era. The gate closed behind them. The mountains stayed ahead of them, and to the west, blue and indifferent and enormous, for the first 40 minutes of the drive. Avery kept her eyes on the road. Her heartbeat was 61 beats per minute. She was aware of this because she was paying attention to it, which itself told her what state she was moving back into. That specific calibrated awareness, the body watching itself, the instrument panel coming online. She had told Brooks it was a short trip. She had meant it when she said it. She still meant it now. She just wasn't entirely sure, as the road unwound ahead of her and the mountains held their position on the horizon, whether the person who came back to Raven Ridge after those 3 or 4 weeks would be the same one who was leaving now, and whether that was something she was ready for, and whether it mattered that she wasn't. The road curved west. The last of Ashford Crossing disappeared in the rear-view mirror. Reese said without turning from the window, You ever worked this region before? The Larimer County terrain? Similar, Avery said. What's your read on the ridge approach? The satellite image showed a lot of open ground between the tree line and the optimal position. Avery was quiet for a moment, reading the mountains ahead of her against the image in her memory from the briefing printout. We don't move in daylight, she said. We go up the night before and hold. Ground temperature by evening will be in the teens. We layer accordingly, and we don't move more than necessary once we're in position. Reese turned from the window and looked at her. You've done extended cold hides before. Yes. How long? Longest was 19 hours. A pause. Montana. February. Reese turned back to the window. Right, she said, with the specific quietness of someone filing information and choosing not to comment on it. Outside, the first snow of the afternoon was beginning. Not heavy, just the initial scatter of flakes that preceded the real weather, catching the light for a moment before disappearing into the gray of the road surface. Avery drove, and the mountains came closer, and the snow fell, and something in her that had been still for 3 years was breathing again. The snow was heavier by the time they reached the Larimer County property line. Not a storm, not yet, but the kind of sustained, purposeful snowfall that the northern Colorado mountains produced in November with the indifference of a process that had been running for 10,000 years and had no opinion about operational timelines. It reduced visibility on the approach road to roughly 200 meters, and turned the satellite image's open ground between the tree line and the ridge into something that looked different in person than it had looked on paper, which was always the case and never stopped being the problem. Reese had the printed map on her knee. She'd been cross-referencing it with the terrain for the last 8 minutes without comment, which Avery had decided to read as competence rather than silence. "We're a kilometer short of the access boundary," Reese said. "If we park here and go on foot, the approach to the tree line is 40 minutes in this snow, maybe 50. 45, Avery said. "We stay in the vehicle until 2100. Temperature will drop another 6 degrees and the network's external security will be on reduced rotation. Cold makes people compress their patterns." Reese looked at her. "You got that from the brief?" "I got it from February in Montana." Reese looked back at the map. "Fair." They sat in the vehicle for 3 hours. Avery ate half a protein bar and drank water from a stainless bottle and ran the approach route in her mind 7 times from memory until the variables she could anticipate felt stable and the ones she couldn't felt named. Naming the unknown variables was the closest thing to managing them that actually worked. You didn't eliminate uncertainty by preparing. You eliminated the surprise of it. At 2047, her phone buzzed. Wrist, from a line that wasn't registered to anything with Wrist's name on it. Satellite pass confirms 12 heat signatures at primary structure. Meeting is active. Vehicle count suggests all principals present. You are go for position establishment. She put the phone away and looked at Reese. "Let's move." The ridge was exactly as the satellite image suggested and completely different from what the satellite image conveyed. The open ground was crusted snow over frozen grass, which meant each step had a 2-stage give, the crust holding for a fraction of a second before yielding, that required a specific adjustment in gait to minimize sound. The tree line, when they reached it, was lodgepole pine growing dense enough to kill the ambient wind almost completely, which changed the temperature equation and also changed the acoustics in ways that required adjustment. Avery moved through it by feel more than calculation. This was the part of the work that couldn't be taught to a standard that produced consistent results: the spatial reading, the body's ongoing assessment of surface and angle and sound profile, the processing that happened below the level of conscious decision. She had spent years developing it and 3 years trying to determine whether she missed it. Standing in the dark timber at 8,200 feet, with snow falling silently through the canopy and her heartbeat at 54 beats per minute, she had her answer, and it was complicated. Reese moved well. Better than well. She moved with the specific economy of someone who had learned field movement in environments where it mattered, adjusting without instruction to Avery's pace changes, stopping when Avery stopped, holding her body orientation to minimize silhouette. She wasn't as quiet, but the gap was smaller than Avery had expected, and she noted it without comment. They reached the primary position at 2,134. It was a natural depression in the ridgeline, partially sheltered by a rock outcrop, with a direct sight line to the south face of the main building at a measured distance. Reese ran the rangefinder, of 614 meters, slightly closer than the satellite assessment. The correction worked in their favor. Avery settled into position, deployed the observation scope rather than the rifle optic. This was a watch mission, not an engagement, and she wanted the wider field that the spotting scope gave her. The building's south face came into resolution, warm light through curtained windows, 2 exterior figures visible at the corner of the structure, standard security posture, hands visible, radio earpieces catching the light when they moved. 2 exterior, she said quietly. "Counting 4 vehicle positions," Reese said from her right, reading through her own optic. 3 have drivers still present, 1 empty. Drivers present means the principals don't plan to stay late. They want to move. Avery adjusted the scope slightly. "Get Wrist the vehicle plate reads if you can." Already pulling them. They held position for 2 hours and 17 minutes. The snow continued. The temperature dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit, which was cold enough to matter, but not cold enough to degrade function if the layering was right. And Avery's layering was right because she had been doing this since before she was old enough to understand why she was doing it. Her grandfather's land in Wyoming had winters that made Colorado feel mild, and whatever else the old man had been, he had known how to teach patience and stillness and the value of staying in position when everything in your body wanted to shift. At 2351, the building's main entrance opened. 4 men came out, then 2 more. Then, after a gap of about 90 seconds, a 7th figure who moved differently from the others. Slower, more deliberate, the specific movement pattern of a person accustomed to having the space around them managed by other people. He wore a heavy overcoat and stood on the entrance steps for a moment looking out at the property with the expression of someone taking inventory. Avery had the spotting scope on him at 614 meters. Even at night, with the building's exterior lights providing back illumination, she could see enough. "Primary," she said. "Confirming," Reese said. "Height, build, posture match the assessment photo. That's him." His name in the Harrogate brief was listed as Gerald Mast, 53 years old, CEO of a legitimate freight brokerage called Consolidated Mountain Logistics, board member of 2 regional business associations, donor to 3 state-level political campaigns, and the man who, according to the task force's internal assessment, had authorized the removal of Sarah Cord when her environmental inspection work got too close to the warehouse anomalies. Avery watched him through the scope. He was talking to the man beside him. Unhurried, occasional gestures, the body language of someone reviewing a completed agenda item rather than someone under pressure. He laughed once at something, a short laugh, the kind that comes easily to people who operate in environments where the consequences of their decisions land on people they never see. Her finger was nowhere near the trigger. The rifle was in the drag bag 6 inches from her right hand. She breathed and watched, and kept her heartbeat where it was. "I have clean confirmation on the primary," she said into the headset. "Wrist, you're getting this feed?" "Confirmed. Recording. Hold position." Mast finished his conversation, nodded twice, and went back inside. The other figures dispersed to vehicles. 3 of the 4 cars departed within 12 minutes. The 4th stayed. Avery tracked the exterior security figures. One rotated to the eastern side of the building. The other stayed at the main entrance. "He's staying the night," Reese said. "Yes." "That changes the extraction window." "It changes the observation schedule. It doesn't change the extraction." Avery recalculated the timeline mentally. If Mast was staying, the meeting was likely continuing in a reduced format. Final coordination, documentation, the kind of conversation that happened after the larger group left and only the essential principles remained. "Get Risk the vehicle that stayed. I want to know who's still inside with him." "What?" The answer came back 40 minutes later, relayed through Risk's line in a compressed text message that Reese read aloud in a voice barely above the ambient wind. "Secondary principal, named Dolan, Warren, 48, former county official, currently listed as a private consultant. He's the legal architecture, contracts, documentation, the paper layer that insulates the operational structure from direct attribution." "So Mast and his lawyer," Avery said. "Not his lawyer, his constructor." Reese's voice had a specific flatness when she said it. "Dolan designed the corporate structure that buried what happened to Sarah Cord. The environmental inspection findings went into a county review process that he managed from the outside. They disappeared." Avery was quiet for a moment. "How close are we to prosecutable?" she asked. "Risk says 30 days if tonight's confirmation plus the vehicle data builds the pattern they need. The recordings from this meeting, if they got audio in the building..." Reese paused, checked her phone. "They got partial audio. Enough to establish association and agenda, not enough to stand alone. But combined with tonight's surveillance confirmation, the plates, and the prior material..." She stopped. "She says it's close. Not there yet, but close." Avery kept the scope on the building. 30 days. Sarah Cord had been dead for 6 weeks, and the people responsible for it were inside a building 614 meters away, having a late-night conversation, and the process that would eventually hold them to account for it was 30 days away from having enough to move. The snow fell. The exterior security figure at the main entrance shifted his weight from one foot to the other and checked his watch. "Wrist wants to know if you can hold position until 0400, Reese said. "There's a secondary vehicle movement expected. Another individual may arrive with physical documentation that would accelerate the timeline." "Yes," Avery said. They held until 0417. The secondary vehicle arrived at 0149 and departed at 0312. and Reese captured the plates and the physical description of the individual who carried a hard-sided case from the vehicle to the building and returned 35 minutes later without it. At 0417, Avery called the position clear. The extraction took 50 minutes through the snow and the dark, and by the time they reached the vehicle, Avery's hands were cold enough that she sat on them for 2 minutes before starting the engine, which was the kind of detail that the operational reports never quite captured. The mundane physical cost of the work, the body paying its invoice in small increments. She drove south with the heater running and Reese beside her pulling together the night's documentation into a compressed summary for Risk's morning brief, and neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes, and the silence was the comfortable kind that comes between people who have done something together that required focus and are letting the focus wind down at its own pace. "You did this for 3 years, Reese said eventually. "The classified unit." "Similar work, different context." "How different?" Avery considered the question. "More kinetic, less patience work." She paused. "Tonight was better." Reese looked at her. "Better how?" "Nobody died." Reese was quiet for a moment, then, "Yeah, that is better." The full debrief happened at 0900 in the Marriott conference room, which had been reconfigured overnight, the whiteboard cleared, a second table added, Pollard running a recording setup in the corner with the focused attention of a man who understood that the documentation of this session was potentially more important than the session itself. Rist was already there when they arrived, and she had the look of someone who had not slept but had processed enough incoming data to reach a point of clarity that functioned as a substitute. Harmon was present, which was unexpected. Avery hadn't seen him since the Raven Ridge debrief, along with a woman she didn't recognize who was introduced as Deputy Director Lena Ferris, Federal, the kind of title that entered a room slightly ahead of the person carrying it. Ferris was 60, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that made Rist's pressed civilian jacket look casual. She had the stillness of someone who had reached a career altitude where emotional visibility was a managed choice rather than a default. She looked at Avery the way experienced people looked at capability assessments, not sizing up the person exactly, but evaluating the specific instrument. "Specialist Collins," Ferris's voice was dry and precise. "I've been read into your file. The full version." She paused on that. "I have some questions that are not part of the operational debrief." Rist, across the table, looked carefully neutral. "All right," Avery said. "The voluntary transfer, 3 years ago." Ferris folded her hands on the table. "Your unit commander at the time recommended against it. He noted his preference for me to continue. He didn't block the request, because he couldn't block it under the applicable regulations. That's different from recommending against it." "Yes." The psychological evaluation attached to the transfer noted, and I'm paraphrasing, a developing dissociation between operational identity and personal identity. The evaluator's recommendation was continued integration work rather than complete role separation. Ferris looked at her without inflection. "You transferred anyway." "I did." "Why?" Avery had been asked versions of this question 3 times in 2 days, and each time she had given a version of the truth calibrated to the person asking. Ferris, she assessed, required the least calibrated version. Because the evaluator was describing something real, she said. The integration work he was recommending was the kind that happens alongside continued operational deployment. I didn't believe I could do the integration while staying in the environment that was causing the separation. I needed out of the cycle to find the baseline again. And did you find it? Avery thought about 3 years of fuel accountability forms and 6-kilometer morning runs and bad coffee and Kowalski's jokes, the way the mountains looked on clear mornings, the specific weight of a clipboard versus a rifle case. "Yes," she said. Partially. The baseline shifted. That's what 3 years does. I found a version of it that was functional and honest. Whether it was the same as what I started with? No, that was probably never going to happen. Ferris was quiet for a moment, studying her with the attentive non-expression of someone whose job had made her good at assessing people's relationship to their own stated truths. "The engagement at Ashford Crossing," Ferris said. "The day before the Harrogate observation. Psychologically, how did it land?" Avery hadn't expected that question, which meant Ferris was asking it deliberately and had known she hadn't expected it. It was hard, Avery said, and it was right. Both things simultaneously. She paused. It reminded me what I'd built the capability for. Not what I'd used it for in the unit, but what it was originally for. In a cleaner sense. Protecting people. Yes. Rather than the operational objectives that sometimes obscure that. Yes. Ferris unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. I'm going to tell you something, Specialist Collins, that's not in your brief and is not going to be documented in this session. The room was very quiet. Pollard had his eyes on his equipment, professionally elsewhere. Rist was still careful neutral. Harmon had the expression of someone who knew what was coming. We have been trying to build the Harrogate case for 14 months, Ferris said. In that time, we have lost 2 intelligence assets, not to direct action, but to the legal and structural interference that Dolan constructs. Material disappears. Witnesses become unavailable. The paper trails that look solid at 60 days become unusable at 90. We have been one step behind this network's administrative capacity for over a year. She paused. What you provided last night, the surveillance confirmation, the vehicle documentation, the secondary individual's presence, and the physical case he brought, closes a gap that we have been trying to close since last April. Avery waited. The timeline I gave you was 30 days, Ferris said. It is now, based on last night's data, closer to 15. If the audio extraction from the internal recording confirms what the preliminary pass suggests, it may be 10. Avery looked at the table for a moment. At the photograph of Sarah Cord, which she had left face up at the end of the previous session, and which was still there, which either meant nobody had moved it or Rist had left it intentionally. What happens at 10 days, Avery said. Federal warrants, asset seizure across all 3 warehouse facilities simultaneously, arrests of Mast, Dolan, and 4 secondary figures. Ferris paused. If it holds through the legal process, which Dolan will make difficult, it holds. If it doesn't, we rebuild from the current position, which is considerably stronger than any position we've been in before. And you're telling me this because you took a personal risk to establish that position, and you have the right to know what it was for. Ferris looked at her directly. And because I want to offer you something formally, with full documentation rather than through the informal channel Major Rist used 2 nights ago. Avery glanced at Rist. Rist had the expression of someone who had been expecting this moment and was not entirely comfortable being in the room for it. What's the offer? Avery said. A role in the coordination office, non-deployable, primarily analytical, with an option for field assessment tasking at your discretion, meaning you choose when you go and you retain a board authority without override. Ferris's delivery was measured, no sales quality, no artificial urgency. Full reclassification, rank advancement to match your actual operational history, and a posting location of your choice within a reasonable operational radius. Avery was quiet. The 3 years in logistics, Ferris said. The skills you built there. Supply chain analysis, accountability tracking, operational logistics assessment, they're not irrelevant to what we do. People with that background and your other background are not common. That's a specific sales point, Avery said. It's accurate. I don't make inaccurate sales points. Ferris sat back. You don't have to decide today. You don't have to decide before the warrants are executed. You don't have to decide at all. She looked at Avery without softening the look. But I wanted the offer made correctly by someone with the authority to make it, rather than through an after-midnight door knock. Rist cleared her throat slightly. Harmon studied the tabletop. Avery looked at the photograph of Sarah Cord, the direct eyes, the particular seriousness of a woman who had walked into a county office and done her job and documented what she found and was dead 6 weeks later because what she found was the wrong thing. She thought about 11 degrees Fahrenheit on a ridge at 8,200 feet, and her heart beat at 54, and the clarity that had returned to her through the scope, not the destructive clarity of the hostage engagement, but the watching clarity, the patience clarity, the kind that didn't cost the same way. When will you know about the audio extraction? She said. 48 hours, possibly less. I'll give you my answer after the warrants execute. She looked at Ferris. I want to know it worked before I decide what comes next. Ferris held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once. That's a reasonable position. The 48 hours became 31. The audio extraction came back at 1843 on the second day with a confirmation that made Pollard exhale loud enough to be audible through the door of the room where he was working. Rist texted Avery a single word, sufficient, which in context carried the weight of 14 months of work arriving at its conclusion. The warrants were filed and sealed that evening. Ferris's office coordinated with the federal district, and the execution was set for 6 days out, enough time to ensure simultaneous multi-site action across all 3 warehouse locations. Avery was in Ashford Crossing for all of it, housed in the secured accommodation that Rist had arranged. A rented apartment on the 4th floor of a building with good sight lines and 2 exits, which she had confirmed before unpacking. Not because she had reason to believe it was necessary, but because some evaluations were automatic by now, and she'd stopped apologizing for them. She ran every morning on the city's river trail, which was mostly empty in November and had the specific quality of maintained public spaces in winter. Reduced, honest, stripped of the seasonal decoration. She ate at a diner 2 blocks from the apartment where the coffee was mediocre and the eggs were exactly what she wanted, and the waitress called everyone Han, regardless of age or apparent status, which Avery found obscurely comforting in a way she didn't examine too closely. She called Brooks on day 3. He picked up on the second ring. Collins? Sergeant? You sound like you're outside. River trail. Cold there? Manageable. She kept running, phone to her ear, which was not ideal form, but she'd had this conversation style before. The operation looks like it's going to work. I heard. Galvez has been following the public-facing part of it. There isn't a public-facing part of it yet. There's about to be. She's connected enough to know the direction. A pause, the sound of him settling back in a chair somewhere. What are you going to do? There's an offer on the table. From the Federal Coordination Office. She slowed her pace slightly. How do you know about that? Because it's the logical next step, and risk type doesn't leave people in the field without making the move. And because Galvez got a call from someone in Ferris's office asking about your performance record here. He paused. Which I believe she described as, quote, unusually strong for a logistics posting. Something in Avery's chest shifted. A small, involuntary warmth that she didn't try to talk herself out of. She could have just said adequate. Galvez doesn't say adequate when she means something else. Another pause. You thinking about taking it? I'm thinking about it. What's the sticking point? She ran for a moment without answering, the river beside her moving dark and cold between ice-edged banks. I built something at Raven Ridge, she said. It wasn't what I came from, but it was mine. I'm not sure I'm ready to decide that it's over. It doesn't have to be over. Brooks's voice was level. You know what the option is, Collins? You know what it means for what you've been doing. It means neither thing is exactly what I had. No. It means you get to be what you actually are instead of one version of it. He paused. That's what you told me you went to logistics to find, right? The difference between what you are and what you were trained to do. She stopped running, stood on the trail with the river beside her, and the cold air on her face and her heartbeat returning to its resting level with the specific efficiency of a body that had been maintained carefully. Yeah, she said. That's what I said. So, she looked at the river, watched it for a moment. So, she said. Brooks was quiet for a few seconds. The range certification program here loses its best observer when you go. I want you to know I'm logging that as a formal complaint. She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter, quieter, but in the same neighborhood. Noted, she said. I'll be back for my gear in a week. I'll have someone keep Kowalski away from your locker. You don't have to do that. No, but I will anyway. A pause. Stay safe, Specialist. Yes, Sergeant. She hung up and stood on the trail for another minute, watching the river. Then she turned around and ran back toward the apartment, into the cold that was manageable but real, her breath making small visible clouds that the morning air dissolved almost immediately. 6 days until the warrants executed. Then she'd know. Then she'd decide. She ran, and the city woke up around her, and the tattoo was under her sleeve where it had always been. Not hidden exactly, not displayed, just present, the way the things that shaped you were always present once you stopped trying to make them into something other than what they were. The warrants executed on a Tuesday. Avery knew the day and the approximate time, 0600 simultaneous across all three sites, because Rist had told her, and because she'd been awake since 0430 in the apartment on the fourth floor, sitting at the window with coffee she'd made at 0445 and watching the city come to life in the pre-dawn dark the way cities did, incrementally, lights appearing in windows without ceremony, the first delivery trucks moving through intersections that were otherwise empty. She was not part of the execution team. That had been clear from the beginning. Her role had been observation and confirmation, and those were finished, and the work that came next belonged to people with different training and different authorization. She understood this cleanly and without resentment, which itself told her something about how she'd changed from the person she'd been at 23, who had needed to be the one executing in order to feel that the work was real. At 0601, her phone buzzed. Wrist again. 2 words this time. All sites. She set the phone down and drank her coffee and watched the city. At 800, the first news alert appeared on her phone. A brief wire item about federal law enforcement activity at a commercial warehouse facility in Larimer County. No details yet. Ongoing situation. By 0900, there were 3 more alerts, each one with slightly more information than the last, the news cycle beginning to assemble the shape of something from the fragments it could access publicly. Gerald Mast's name didn't appear in any of them yet. It would, eventually, and when it did, it would appear in the business section before it moved to the front pages, which was usually how it went with people whose criminality was structured through commerce rather than spectacle. Warren Dolan's name appeared first, actually. A reporter at a regional outlet had connected a federal court filing to a name that appeared in county records, which was the specific kind of documentary thread-pulling that good local journalists did better than anyone, and Avery noted it with something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was in the same territory. She read the item twice. Then she put her phone face down on the windowsill and finished her coffee. Reese knocked at 0915. She came in with 2 paper cups from the diner 2 blocks over. The mediocre coffee, which had become something of an unspoken acknowledgement between them over the past week that mediocre things could be consistent and consistency had its own value. "It's clean so far," Reese said, sitting on the edge of the couch with both cups balanced on her knee until Avery took one. All 3 sites secured, minimal resistance. Dolan was at his home address. They picked him up at 0612 still in his bathrobe, which I'm choosing to find satisfying. And Mast? His attorney arrived at the warehouse site at 0645, which means Mast made a call between 0600 and 0645, which means he was awake and knew something was wrong before the team got to him. They picked him up at a secondary property, a cabin property outside the county line, at 0748. Avery looked at her. Secondary property wasn't in the brief. No, his attorney knew about it. Apparently the attorney is cooperating, which Harmon says is the most surprising thing to happen this morning, and Harmon has seen a lot of mornings. Avery drank the coffee. It was exactly as mediocre as always, which was to say it was hot and it was coffee, and those 2 things were sufficient. "The physical case," she said, "the one the secondary individual brought to the ranch meeting. Evidence team has it. Pollard says the documentation inside is, and I'm using his exact word, comprehensive. He looked like a man who had just found exactly what he was looking for in a place he'd been searching for 14 months. Reese paused. He also said, and this is a direct quote, that without last week's surveillance confirmation, they wouldn't have known to connect that case to this location, and it would have been moved or destroyed before the warrants executed. Avery held the coffee cup and looked at the window. Sarah Cord found those warehouse anomalies, she said. 6 weeks before they killed her. Yes. Did she know what she was looking at when she documented them? Reese was quiet for a moment. The file suggests she knew something was wrong. Whether she understood the full scope, she paused. Probably not. She was an environmental inspector. She was looking at storage violations and chemical disposal irregularities. The rest of it was underneath. She documented it anyway. Yes. Avery set the coffee cup on the windowsill. Okay, she said. That's what I needed to know. Ferris called at 1100. Not a text. Not a relay through wrist. A direct call from a number that Avery had been given in a sealed envelope at the beginning of the operation with the instruction to keep it available but not to initiate. Collins. Ferris's voice had the same dry precision as in person. We have full site control. The documentation from the Larimer County property substantially exceeds what the brief projected. Harmon's team is calling it the most complete operational record they've recovered in an active case in several years. A pause. I wanted you to hear that directly. Thank you. Have you considered the offer? Avery looked at the window. The city had fully woken up now. Mid-morning traffic, people on the sidewalks, the ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday in a mid-sized Colorado city that had no idea what had happened in the pre-dawn hours in a warehouse on its outskirts. Yes, she said. And? I have a condition I didn't raise in the debrief. Tell me. Sarah Cord's documentation. The environmental inspection findings. They went into a county review process that Dolan managed from the outside and buried them. Avery's voice was even. When this case resolves, I want someone in your office to make sure those findings don't disappear again. The environmental violations she documented were real independent of everything else. They should be prosecuted on their own terms. Silence for a moment on Ferris's end. Not the silence of someone caught off guard, but the silence of someone noting what they've just heard and what it implies about the person who said it. That's not a condition that affects your role, Ferris said. That's a separate remediation request. I know what it is. Will you do it? Yes, Ferris said. I'll personally ensure the findings are referred to the appropriate state environmental authority with a federal cooperation notation. That will give them enough weight to move forward. Then yes, I'll take the offer. Another pause. Shorter this time. Good. The formal documentation will come through channels, but I wanted the agreement verbal first. You'll hear from my office before end of week. A beat. Collins. Director. The condition you named, Sarah Cord. Ferris's voice shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but less processed. The specific frequency shift of a person saying something they mean without the professional coding. That's the right instinct. I want you to keep having it. Avery held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Then she put it in her pocket and went to find Reese. She found her in the building's small common area on the second floor, a room with 3 chairs and a table and a window that looked out on the building's interior courtyard, which was not scenic, but was quiet. Reese was eating something from a wrapper that looked like it had been purchased from a vending machine, which was probably true. I took the offer, Avery said. Reese looked at her, chewed, swallowed. When do you start? Documentation this week. Formal start date is flexible. Ferris said I can finish my current logistics posting commitments. Will you? Avery sat in the chair across from her. Galvez and I need to talk. I owe her a proper transition, not a form filed from a different city. She paused. And there's gear in my locker at Raven Ridge. Reese was quiet for a moment. She folded the wrapper from her vending machine item with a precision that was probably unconscious. The posting location, she said. Did you decide? Not yet. Ferris said within operational radius, which gives me options. Are you going to stay near Raven Ridge? Avery thought about it. The mountains to the north on clear mornings, the motor pool smell, the 6-kilometer perimeter trail, the particular quality of high-altitude silence in the early morning before the base woke up fully. Probably not. She looked at the courtyard window. Something in that radius, but not on top of it. I need to be able to visit without living inside it. Reese nodded slowly. That's a reasonable distinction. I thought so. They sat for a moment without speaking. Through the window, a pigeon landed on the courtyard wall, looked at nothing specifically, and departed. Collins, Reese said. Reese. On the ridge, that night. She looked at her wrapper, not at Avery. When Mast came out and you had him in the scope, I watched you. Not the target. You. For about 30 seconds. She paused. You didn't move. No. What were you thinking? Avery considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer Reese, who would identify anything less. I was thinking about the 4 seconds, she said. The dead wind window from the Ashford Crossing shot. I was thinking about the difference between that morning and this one. What was in the scope each time? She looked at the window. And I was thinking that the difference is the whole thing. That's the whole job right there, knowing which one it is. Reese was quiet for a moment. And you're okay with spending more time on the second kind? I think the second kind is what the first kind was always supposed to be protecting. Reese looked at her. Something in her expression settled. A specific settling, the kind that happened when a person decided they understood something about someone and were choosing to trust it. Okay, she said. Amassen. She drove back to Raven Ridge on Thursday. The road north from Ashford Crossing followed the mountain front for 30 kilometers before turning west into the higher terrain, and Avery drove it with the windows cracked despite the cold because the air at this altitude in November had a quality she'd been away from for 2 weeks and had apparently been missing without noticing. It smelled like pine and dry cold, and something that didn't have a name but was specific to this particular region, this particular elevation, the specific combination of geography and season that she had been breathing every morning for 3 years. She arrived at 1340. The gate guard, a private she recognized from the motor pool section, checked her clearance and waved her through with the slightly elevated attentiveness of someone who had heard the general shape of what had happened and was trying not to show that they knew. She parked and sat in the vehicle for a moment. The base looked exactly as it had looked 2 weeks ago. The barracks building, the A bay, the range facility at the far end, the peaks to the north with their November snowpack catching the afternoon light. Nothing had changed. The specific indifference of institutional spaces to individual significance was one of the things she had spent 3 years learning to find reassuring rather than depressing. She got out and went to find Galvez. Galvez was in her office, which was a small room adjacent to the operations center with a desk covered in the specific archaeology of administrative accumulation. Forms, reports, binders, a coffee mug that had been there since before Avery arrived and would likely be there after she left. Galvez looked up when Avery knocked on the open door, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did. Rapid internal processing displayed briefly on the surface before the professional composure reasserted itself. Collins? Sit down. She sat. I have news, Captain. I have an idea what kind. Galvez leaned back in her chair. Ferris's office called me this morning. They wanted confirmation of your performance record and a commanding officer assessment. What did you tell them? What I told them is my business. Galvez folded her hands. What I'm telling you is that whatever I said, I meant it. A pause. Are you taking it? Yes. Galvez nodded, looking at the desk surface rather than at Avery, which was itself a form of communication. Timeline? Formal start is flexible. I want to give you a proper transition period, 4 to 6 weeks if that's workable. Full handover on the accountability portfolio, recommendations on the fuel coordination succession. Galvez looked up. You don't owe me 4 to 6 weeks. The offer is federal level. The clearance supersedes your current posting obligations. I know. I want to do it right. Galvez was quiet for a moment. She had the expression of someone who had been in command long enough to have watched a lot of people leave and had never quite made their peace with the fact that the ones worth keeping were always the ones who could afford to go. 4 weeks, Galvez said. I'll process the transition documentation this week. You're seconded to the new office effective your start date, but your logistics function here runs through week 4. Yes, Captain. And Collins. Galvez picked up her pen, turned it over in her hand without writing anything. The commendation recommendation I submitted the morning after Ashford Crossing. I want you to know that paperwork exists regardless of where you end up posted. It's in the record. Avery looked at her. Thank you, Captain. Don't thank me. It's accurate. She put the pen down. Go find Brooks. He's been pretending he hasn't been waiting for you to show up. Brooks was not pretending anything. He was in the range office with the door open and a cup of coffee that looked recent. And when she appeared in the doorway, he looked up with the specific expression of someone who had calibrated their expectation carefully and was checking it against the reality. You look tired, he said. 2 weeks of Marriott pillows. Sit down. She sat. He poured her coffee from the pot on the filing cabinet without asking, which was the kind of presumption she permitted from approximately 3 people on Earth, and he was one of them. The offer, he said. Done. Accepted this morning officially. He nodded slowly. Ferris's office. Yes. Good office. He said it like someone who had professional context for that assessment, which she had always suspected and never asked about directly. The field assessment component. You're keeping that discretionary? Yes. My call, my timeline, a board authority retained. And the analytical role? Supply chain analysis, operational logistics assessment, capability evaluation. It uses the logistics background. She looked at the coffee. All of it, apparently. The 3 years here didn't go anywhere. Brooks held his cup and looked at her with the expression she'd first seen in October at the range. That attentive, non-invasive attention, the kind that asked questions by being still enough that answers became possible. I want to say something, he said, and I want you to let me finish before you respond. All right. You came here 3 years ago and you were... He stopped, started again. You were functional, you were competent, but you were also someone who had packaged something very large into a very small space and was managing the compression by keeping everything quiet. He set his cup down. What I've watched over 3 years is that compression slow down. The package didn't get smaller, but you got bigger around it. That's not nothing. That's actually the hard work. He looked at her. I don't want you to take this new posting and immediately recompress. That would be the wrong use of what you built here. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. Do you? Yes. She paused. I took the condition I attached to accepting the offer as the signal. It was about Sarah Cord's environmental findings, making sure the work she did mattered on its own terms, separate from the operational outcome. She held the coffee cup. That's not compression. That's knowing what the work is for. Brooks was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the subtle rearrangement of a face that didn't do sentimental easily. No, he said. That's not compression. They sat with that for a moment. The range office around them quiet and familiar. The cleaning equipment in the corner, the qualification boards on the wall, the view of the range through the single window where the target stood, patient and inanimate in the late afternoon light. I want you to know, Avery said, that this is the posting where I figured out the difference between what I was trained to do and who I am. She looked at him directly. That happened here. I want you to know that. Brooks held her gaze. He didn't perform anything in response, didn't reach for words that would inflate the moment or deflect from it. I know, he said. Now go deal with Kowalski. He's been in the motor pool for 2 hours pretending to check tire pressure. Kowalski was, in fact, in the motor pool, and he was not entirely pretending. One of the Humvees did have a pressure discrepancy he'd actually noticed, which was the kind of accidental competence that Avery had always believed existed underneath the performance. He looked up when she came around the end of the vehicle row, and he had the expression he'd been carrying since the day after Ashford Crossing, the specific expression of a man still working out how to be in someone's presence after the framework he'd used to organize that presence had collapsed. You're back, he said, for a few weeks. Then I'm gone. He absorbed that, set down the pressure gauge. The new posting. Yes. He looked at his hands, then at her. The tattoo, he said. I know I already said sorry. I'm not going to say it again because I think saying it again makes it about me. He paused, which was a more sophisticated pause than she would have expected from him 6 months ago. I just want you to know that I see it differently now, if that matters. It matters some, she said honestly. He nodded. Some is fair. She looked at him for a moment. 24 years old, Wyoming raised, still figuring out the difference between the person he performed in a group and the person he was when the performance ran out. Kowalski. Yeah. The pressure gauge. Write it up. Don't leave it for the next shift. His mouth moved toward a smile, stopped partway. Yes, specialist. Good. She turned to go. Collins. His voice was quieter now, the group performance register gone. Those people in the building in Ashford Crossing, the hostages. He stopped. I've been thinking about them. Not the shooting, just they got to go home. She looked back at him. They got to go home, she said. Yes. She left him with the pressure gauge and walked back across the motor pool in the late afternoon light. She spent the 4 weeks finishing what she'd started. The fuel accountability handover took 2.5 weeks, longer than expected, because the filing system she'd built over 3 years was organized according to a logic that existed primarily in her head, and translating it into documentation that someone else could follow required more time than the system itself had required to build. She stayed late 4 times to finish it correctly. Nobody asked her to. She did it because the work deserved a complete ending. The ammunition accountability portfolio. She handed to a corporal named Abigail Stern who had been in the unit for 8 months and had the particular quality of someone who paid attention without announcing it, which Avery recognized and trusted. The morning runs she kept all 4 weeks. The river trail in Ashford Crossing had been good, but the perimeter trail at Raven Ridge was hers in a way that external spaces weren't, and she ran it every morning until the last week, when the snow came in heavy from the north and the trail became something closer to a field navigation exercise, and she ran it anyway. On the last Tuesday, she packed her room in the same 30 minutes she'd packed it the first time. Less than she'd expected to have accumulated in 3 years. The photograph of her grandfather's Wyoming property, the personal kit, 3 books she'd read twice each, the folded personnel report from the bottom drawer which she took out and looked at for a moment before putting in her bag, not because she needed to read it, but because she had decided that carrying it was different from being controlled by it, and she was ready to carry it again. She left the room key on the desk. In the hallway, Yesenia Marsh from the motor pool was coming out of the adjacent room and nearly walked into her, which was almost exactly how this had started 11 weeks ago, the morning of November 14th, and the parallel wasn't lost on either of them. "You're leaving today?" Marsh said. "This morning." Marsh looked at her with the straightforward expression of someone who had never required a complicated relationship with Avery and therefore didn't have one. "You were good here," she said simply. "Whatever else, you were good here." Avery looked at her. "The maintenance rotation you were worried about in November. Did it get pushed?" "Twice." Marsh made a face. "Ended up running it in December, which was a disaster. You were right about the weather." "Usually are." Marsh smiled at that, a small, real smile. "Take care of yourself, Collins." "You too." She walked down the hallway for the last time and out the barracks door into the January morning, which was cold and clear and had the specific quality of high-altitude winter. The sky a saturated blue. The peaks to the north carrying heavy snow. The light coming in at a low angle that made everything on the base look briefly more dimensional than it was. She put her bag in the vehicle, stood beside it for a moment. Brooks was crossing the parade ground from the direction of the range office. He had no particular reason to be crossing the parade ground at this hour, which meant he'd been watching for her departure. She waited for him. He stopped 6 feet away, the distance of 2 people who respect each other's space. "Everything square?" he said. "Everything square." "The stern corporal. She'll handle the accountability portfolio." "She will. I left notes on the edge cases." He nodded. Looked at her with the look she had come to understand over months was his version of warmth. Not performed, not amplified, just present. "You did good work here," he said. "The regular kind and the other kind, both matter." "I know they do. That's what I came here to find out." He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was what she'd expected, firm, brief, the handshake of a man who used it to communicate something he wouldn't say in other words. "Watch the mountain wind," he said. "Always." She got in the vehicle and drove to the gate and didn't look back, because looking back was something she'd done enough of. And the road ahead of her was clear and cold and specific, and that was sufficient. The formal start date for the coordination office posting was February 3rd. Avery arrived on February 2nd, which was her habit, and which Ferris, to her credit, noted without commenting on. The office was in a building in Denver that had no identifying signage, which was standard, and a coffee machine that was genuinely good, which was not something she'd expected, and which she considered a reasonable indicator of organizational culture. Her workspace was a corner position with a window that looked north toward the mountains, which she had not requested and which someone had assigned to her anyway, and she suspected that someone was Ferris, and she didn't ask. Reese was posted 3 offices down. They ate lunch together twice in the first week and didn't talk about work, which was its own kind of professional language. On February 5th, a brief item appeared in a regional news outlet confirming that Gerald Mast had been indicted on federal charges across 7 counts, with Warren Dolan named as a co-defendant. The article was factual and dry, the kind of legal reporting that described enormous things in language engineered to make them sound manageable. Avery read it twice and saved it to a folder she had created specifically for this, which also contained a separate document she'd printed from the State Environmental Authority's public records, a notice of remediation referral for the warehouse facilities, citing documentation originally compiled by County Environmental Inspector Sarah Cord. Her name was in the official record. Her work was in the chain of custody. Avery held the printout for a moment. Then she added it to the folder and closed it. On the wall beside her desk, she had put 3 things: the photograph of her grandfather's Wyoming property, a calendar with the perimeter trail run schedule she'd adapted for the Denver running paths, and a hand-drawn sketch that Yesenia Marsh had pressed into her hand in the parking lot on the last morning at Raven Ridge. A quick, unpretentious rendering of the mountain peaks visible from the northern perimeter trail, done on the back of a maintenance form in ballpoint pen, anatomically approximate and completely itself. She had put it up without framing it. On February 8th, she pulled up her sleeve at her desk and looked at the tattoo in the clear winter light that came through the north-facing window. The wolf, the 6 numerals, the 7th element that was an I rather than a number. The geometric line work that broke its own rules at the edges. She looked at it for a long time, not with the deflecting distance of other people's mockery, not with the private grief of solitary nights in a barracks room, not with the operational detachment she'd learned to apply to things that cost her. Just looked at it. The 7 names were present in the ink the way they were always present. Not as wounds, not as weapons, not as definitions of what she was or wasn't, as weight that was hers to carry, that she had chosen to carry in the specific form of ink on skin rather than the heavier form of silence around the carrying. The wolf looked back. She pulled her sleeve down and went back to work. She was good at the work, the analytical layer, the capability assessment, the supply chain reading that turned out to translate directly into the kind of structural pattern recognition that Harrogate-type networks tried to hide inside. She was not perfect at it. She made 3 errors in the first month that she caught herself, one that Reese caught, and one that a senior analyst named Torres caught with the polite precision of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that errors in the first month were information about what someone needed to develop, not verdicts about whether they should be there. She developed. She asked questions she didn't know the answers to, which was harder than it sounded for someone who had spent years operating in environments where not knowing was a liability. She sat in briefings where she was the least experienced person in the room and said so when it was relevant, which surprised people until it stopped surprising them. She ran every morning. The Denver paths were different from the Raven Ridge Perimeter Trail, flatter, busier, no altitude burn. But the morning air was still cold and the mountains were still visible to the west on clear days, and that was enough. She called Brooks twice in the first month. The calls were short and specific. Range certification questions she was using to calibrate a capability assessment framework, which was true, and also a reason to call that didn't require explaining that she wanted to. He answered both times, asked 1 personal question per call, which was his ratio, and accepted 1-sentence answers, which was hers. The quiet she'd built at Raven Ridge was different now, not smaller, different in texture, less defended. She had made it with intention and time and the specific stubbornness of someone who knew what they needed and refused to be convinced otherwise. And then she had allowed what happened in November to open the edges of it without collapsing the center. The center held. Not because she was exceptional, not because the years had made her invulnerable to the things that damage people, but because she had paid enough attention to know where her center was and what it required, and she had made her choices accordingly. That was all it was, finally. Not a secret, not a weapon, not a story about the wolf tattoo that everyone had mocked until the moment they stopped. Just someone who knew herself well enough to act from that knowing and was still learning to do it better. In April, a package arrived at the office with a Raven Ridge return address and no note. Inside was a small framed photograph, the view from the observation tower at the top of the steel lattice structure, looking southwest over Ashford Crossing in morning light. The city spread out below, ordinary and alive, intersections and rooftops, and the thin thread of the river running through the eastern neighborhoods. No note, but the frame had a piece of masking tape on the back with 2 words in Brooks's handwriting: both matter. She put it on the wall beside the mountain sketch, the Wyoming photograph, and the calendar. Then she turned back to her desk and the work that was waiting and the morning that was still ahead of her. The people who survive the long haul are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who learned the difference between what they were built for and who they chose to be, and had the patience to close the distance between those two things, one day at a time.